What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2003 BMW E46 M3. Today on the M3 behind me, we're going to be covering rear wheel bearing replacement. Today we're using our OE kit, which includes FAG wheel bearings, some new snap rings, and some new axle nuts. In addition, we're also going to be replacing the rear hubs with some genuine BMW hubs. Just due to the age of the vehicle, those are pretty crusty. Couple things to note, this DIY is going to be applicable to all your E46 chassis in the rear, so pretty straightforward. Today we're working on an M3. Before we get started on this, let's talk a little bit about what happens when your wheel bearings go bad. Now, the effects can be different on every vehicle. Generally though, they start to get noisy as they age. You get like a little warble sound from the wheel that's affected. Sometimes they're both at the same time. Rule of thumb is if you're replacing one, replace the other. You should replace them in pairs always. And typically they're gonna last anywhere from 80 to 100,000 miles. But before we get started on this job, let's take a look at some of the tools we're gonna need for this DIY. For this job, we're going to need a couple basic tools as well as a couple specialty tools. Starting with the basics, we have both a 1/2-inch drive and 3/8 drive torque wrench. We have a 3/8 drive ratchet, and then we have a couple wrenches and sockets. Some of them are duplicates of each other, starting with a 17 millimeter, a 15 millimeter, a 13 millimeter, as well as a 12 millimeter. And we have the same equivalent in socket form. We also have a 7 millimeter hex and a 6 millimeter hex that'll help with the hardware in the brake section, as well as a 5 millimeter hex if you plan on removing your parking brake shoes, as well as a 36 millimeter socket that's going to be handy for our axle nut. Always good to have is a flathead screwdriver as well as a pry bar. We have two different length extensions for our ratchets. We don't know which ones we might need. We also have a big hammer. And now getting more into the specialty side of things, we have a CTA wheel bearing puller tool. We have a CTA, this is 4031. These are really cool. These are snap ring pliers, and they're very adjustable, and they kind of keep everything from bouncing out at you. We have a 2-jaw puller. However, I recommend a 3-jaw puller if you have access to one. This is an axle puller, and that threads onto the end of the axle stub, and you pull it through the hub when you're reinstalling everything. We have a slide hammer, of course. Again, you can probably replicate this with a 3-jaw puller depending on the setup you're working with. We have a small chisel. This is a 1/2-inch chisel. We're going to use that to stake our new axle nuts in place. We have a wheel brush as well as some wool, just so that we can clean up our hub area and any hardware that we want to clean up before we put it back together. This is a New England car, so it's a little bit crusty. And then a couple nice to haves are a digital torque wrench, an electric ratchet. We have a big 1/2-inch impact to get our wheels on and off, and a couple Liqui Moly products for ceramic paste for our brake hardware, some anti-seize for the end of our axles that are going to go into our fresh hubs, and some CV joint grease for the wheel bearings. All right, now that we have all the tools covered, I apologize in advance if we add one or two along the way. Let's get started on this DIY. All right, we are at the rear passenger of the M3. We're going to start on this side. We're working on the lift today. However, this is a job you can easily do on the ground in your garage or in the driveway. One thing I'll note now, if you're following along at home and you are working like that, you want to make sure you have the car in the rear raised enough, wheels chalked up front, so you can lower the exhaust a little bit once we get to the driver's side. I'll show you what we're talking about once we get there. To get the wheel off though, 17 millimeter lug bolt. With that situated, we're going to start by getting our brake and hardware off. So to do that, we're going to start easy, remove that anti-rattle clip. To get our anti-rattle clip off, I like to use a small flathead screwdriver. Sometimes you can pry on the center of it here, get it off, or you can just pry out one ear and then the whole thing will free up, just like that. While I have it here, we're also going to go ahead and remove the wear sensor, which is only on the rear passenger side. The rear driver does not have one. Just set that to the side. From there, you're going to want to remove the 2 dust covers on the rear guide pins. At this point, we're going to remove the caliper. You are able to remove it with the carrier as one. I like to split them up. That way when I hang the caliper to the side, I don't have the carrier bracket in my way as well, but completely up to you. I'm going to grab a 7 millimeter hex and get those guide pins out. With that done, I'm going to grab a bungee cord and just swing it around the rear coil and get it ready to hang my caliper. With our bungee cord situated, we can go ahead and remove our caliper. And then because the hoses on the rear are so short, I like to use a bungee cord. Just get it around the caliper body and let it hang off to the side like that. Now we can grab our 16mm socket and get the two 16mm bolts off that hold our carrier in place. There's two. And just set your bracket to the side. And now we're going to want to work on getting our rotor off. For that, you're going to need a 6mm hex bit to get the set screws off. I'm going to use a small extension just so I can clear the studs. Normally you don't need that for standard equipped. And with those off, we should be able to just pull our rotors off. Set these to the side. All right, we're getting closer, my good people. Our next step is going to be to work on unstaking or unclamping, whatever you like to call it, the axle nut here in the rear. And for that, you're going to need a small flathead screwdriver or a chisel and a hammer so we can pound out these ends. I'm going to use a small chisel and a hammer, just enough to get these out. To break this free, you're going to need a 36mm socket. I'm going to give it a shot with the impact gun. If not, a big half-inch breaker bar will work as well. All right, my good people, at this point we have all our brake components off on the rear passenger. Before we go ahead and continue any further, we're going to go ahead and duplicate the same process on the driver's side. It's going to be identical. And then we're going to hop underneath the M3 and work on removing our sway bar as well as lowering our exhaust so that we can get ready to pull the axles out. So let's get to it. All right, my good people, we are under the M3. At this point, both sides of the vehicle have their brake hardware removed. Now, to continue, normally when you're doing this job, it's almost, I would argue, a little bit easier on the ground because you have to lower the exhaust to get the axle out on the driver's side. Now, because we're on the lift, we're gonna have to be raising and lowering the vehicle so we get it to like eye level to be able to work on it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna remove the exhaust from our center section back just so that we can raise and lower the vehicle without having to support the end of the exhaust system on a screw jack or a floor jack. So either way though, the process of removing these panels so that you can lower your exhaust at home is going to apply to you. You have 8 13mm bolts that hold on these plates, 2 13mm for the exhaust hangers, and then we have 3 16mm for these. So let's get those off. And now for me at this point, we'll head over to the back and show you how to undo the hanger so that you can lower it at home. All right, we're at the back of the M3. Now this car is equipped with a Super Sprint exhaust system, so I just want to make a note of that. So some of the hardware might be a little bit different than your vehicle, depending on what it's equipped with and or if you have stock hardware. I'm using a 12mm on a short extension to get the 2 hangers undone on the left. I have my screw jack holding up the exhaust system in the rear. If you're doing this at home, a floor jack will work perfectly fine. Beautiful. With all our hanger hardware removed, at this point we should be able to drop the rear section of the exhaust. All right, at this point we're gonna go ahead and undo the sway bar end link brackets that connect to our lower control arms in the rear. I've already done the driver's side. I'm gonna show you how to do it on the passenger side. You have a 17mm head bolt up top and a 13mm nut on the bottom. So with a small 17mm stubby wrench, or you can use a long one, whichever one you can fit up there. You're gonna wanna counter hold the head and break the 13 down below. With that hardware removed, all that's left to get this rear sway bar out is 4 6mm hex bolts. So let's go ahead and get those off. And now with all our hardware removed, it's just a matter of fishing the sway bar out. At this point, we're gonna go ahead and break our 6 E12 bolts off. We have 6 on either axle, And typically if you're working on just removing your axles, then your brake hardware is probably going to be on still, at which point you can use that to help you out. You can wedge a flathead screwdriver or a chisel in the vanes of the rotor and just have them lock up against the caliper carrier. That way it holds everything in place. You can break them free, undo it, and repeat. Right now, because we have everything off the car and we're in the air, I'm going to have my good friend Mike counterhold with a breaker bar in between the studs. You can put some lug bolts in place of the studs to do the same thing. We're going to crack them all loose first, and then I'll be able to just go around and zap them off with the ratchet. So you're going to want to repeat the same steps on both sides. With our hardware removed, we should be able to now pull the axle ear off, just like that. And now we're going to go ahead and just do the same thing to the driver's side real quick. Now we can go ahead and work on pushing our axles out. If you don't have an easy reach to the axle behind the hub assembly here, I would suggest using a bungee cord to situate the back of the axle in place so it doesn't fall on the ground. You can use a 2-jaw or a 3-jaw puller. I happen to have a 2-jaw on hand. We're going to give this a shot first. And the idea is that this is going to grip around the hub, and the center piece is going to thread in and push our axle in. All right, at this point we have our axle out. As you can see, this one isn't terribly wasted. Usually they can get pretty noisy as they age or go bad. In some really extreme situations, if the bearing fails completely, the ball bearings will be like ready to come out, and this hub will come out with the inner race. Luckily, this car is nowhere near that. It was just starting to get noisy inside the cabin. Now the goal is to get our hub off. Again, there's a couple ways to do this. In this case, we have studs in place. So I'm going to situate my slide hammer. You can rent these from any auto parts store if you don't feel like buying a whole set for just this job. But the idea is that you get your slide hammer in place, and you would send a couple lug bolts through. We have studs, so I'm going to put a couple lug nuts on. Then you really want to do this with the car a little bit lower on the ground so you can get some good oomph into your swing. But the idea is literally as it sounds. You just do this. Until your whole hub comes out. So with that situated, we can go ahead and set this hub to the side. Now while I have you here, let's talk about the inner race. A lot of you are not going to be replacing your hubs. You're going to be replacing just the wheel bearing, at which point you're going to want to remove this. A bearing separator tool will work in your favor. You mount it here, clamp it down, and it should give you just enough of a window around the inner race and the hub to get that off, at which point you can use a 3-jaw puller with a spacer or a socket against the inside of the hub there to pull that off. If you're feeling a little bit more barbaric, you can take a cutting wheel, give it a good notch in a diagonal way, split it the rest of the way with a chisel. These are pretty crusty. They had a broken set screw in them at one point. They've been retapped. They're kind of messy. We're going to go ahead and replace them. Now let's grab our wheel bearing puller tool and work on pulling out that snap ring and old wheel bearing. All right, next to remove is the snap ring that holds the wheel bearing in place in the hub. I'm going to go ahead and use the CTA tool like I mentioned at the beginning. However, you should be okay using regular snap ring pliers. These are just a little bit more specialized and should hopefully make our lives a little bit easier. All right, we're using our CTA bearing puller tool like we showed you at the beginning. We're going to start by feeding our plate on the back, our washer. Try to center it as best as possible when you get that started. And you can use a pipe wrench or a set of pliers to counter hold the nut on the back. A 32mm socket. You always want to do this by hand. You don't want to use an impact wrench on these tools. There it is. I'm going to go ahead and clean this out a little bit. Hit the edge where the snap ring sits with a little bit of Scotch-Brite pad, very gently. The inside bore itself is very clean. Give it all a good wipe down, and then we'll get ready to install our new FAG bearing. Now the install process, we're going to use the same CTA wheel bearing tool. We're just going to use it backwards. I have a bigger plate that won't come through on the back side to counter hold. We're going to use our threaded rod as well. We'll set our wheel bearing in place like that. You want to make sure it's nice and even. And then we're going to use a plate that is just small enough to feed into the assembly here without getting stuck, but just big enough to cover the outer edge of the wheel bearing. You don't want to press in on the inside or you'll blow the races out. You want to keep it on the outside. You're going to feel it bottom out. Once it's bottomed out, go ahead and remove the tool and make sure it's sitting flush in the hub, and then you have enough room to install your new snap ring. With our tool off, now we have more than enough room to situate our new snap ring. So I'm going to get it situated with the same CTA tool, and then we'll feed it into place. All right, we're going to grab our new hub, get that situated in place. And similar to how we installed the wheel bearing, we're going to use the same tool to drive our hub in. Again, oversized plate on the rear. You want to make sure this goes in nice and straight as well. You don't want to get it crooked, otherwise you'll waste the bearing. We got our pliers on the back, our 32 on the front, and we're just going to tighten this down nice and gently. Make sure it goes in straight. All right, my good people, at this point we have our new hub in. You can see it's nice and tight and quiet, unlike the old one. So I'm going to grab the axle. While you are here, I'm just going to go ahead and feed it in, pop it kind of into the ear of the diff, and then we'll work on pulling it through and bolting it up to the differential. So, all right, we're ready to install our axle. We have a little bit of that Liquid Moly anti-seize paste that we showed you at the beginning. At this point, we have our axle in just enough where we can use our axle puller tool. For these cars, it is the M27 by 1.5. Thread that on there. Once that bottoms out, then we can install the rest of the tool. Open end towards the axle. You want to make sure you get a decent amount of threads in there. Butt it up to the axle, turn it back half a turn. Then your lock nut. Beautiful. At this point, our axle has stuck out more than enough to be able to get that nut on there and torque it down properly. Now let's get the car back up in the air and we'll go ahead and reinstall our 6 E12 Torx bolts. So feed your axle shaft up into the diff ear, and then you can see the old markings where your hardware went along with the washer plate. So we'll go ahead and start with one side here. All right, for now, we're gonna let these be. What we're gonna do is we're gonna reassemble our brakes. And then once our brakes are on, we'll be able to use a screwdriver, jam it into the vane of the rotor so it can hold up the whole assembly, and then we'll torque these down one by one. I'm going to take a little bit of Liquid Moly ceramic paste, place it around the hub area where the rotor is going to sit. That way it keeps the rotor from seizing to the hub, and next time we get in here, it comes off just as nicely as it did before. That's situated. And now we can grab our set screws and reinstall those. We're just gonna go ahead and snug these down, but for those of you following along, if you're gonna torque them down, 12 foot-pounds, 6mm hex. From here, we can install our carrier bracket, two 16mm bolts. We're gonna go ahead and torque these down to 48 foot-pounds. There's two. Now we can go ahead and work on loading up our pads. I like to dabble a little bit of ceramic paste. You can use brake paste as well on the ears where they ride on the carrier bracket. At this point, I like to install my anti-rattle clip. That way it kind of holds the caliper and everything in place while I get the guide pins going. Line up the two ears on your top and bottom, and then just push in the center, nice and easy. With that situated, now we can install our guide pins. Now we're going to take our 7mm hex, same thing on a 3/8 ratchet, and get our guide pin situated. Then we're going to torque them down to 22 foot-pounds. So I have my ratcheting wrench on my 7mm hex bit, and this is what I'm going to do to get that one snugged in, just enough so that I can then get my torque wrench in there. With those both snug up, now we can go ahead and torque them down to 22 foot-pounds. Don't forget to put your dust covers back on. And then last but not least, on the passenger side, you're going to want to reinstall your brake pad wear sensor. Now we have the brakes in place to assist us with tightening the E12 Torx. And what I meant by that earlier was, I'm going to take the screwdriver, and the idea is that you jam it somewhere. So I'm going to use in between the rotor and the caliper, and then we're just going to rinse and repeat basically. We'll tighten down the E12s that we can get to, again 75 foot-pounds. At this point, we have all of our E12s torqued up, 75 foot-pounds. Now what we're going to do is we're going to lower the car, and using the same locking method, we're going to go ahead and install our new axle nut, torque it down the spec, and then this side will be buttoned up. We'll repeat on the driver's side, and then we'll pick back up after that. We have our new axle nut. You always want to replace these whenever you remove them. And now we're going to go ahead and do our best to torque it to 225 foot-pounds. With that situated, the next thing to do, if you remembered at the beginning, we had to unstake these. We're going to go ahead and take a chisel. You can use a flathead screwdriver. We're going to bang in the ends into the axle, just so that we know our axle nut will not come loose. At this point, your axle nut is locked in. You should be good to go. The passenger side is 100% buttoned up. We have our new bearing in, we have our hub back in, we have our brake hardware back in, we have our E-Torx torqued up on the inside towards the diff. Now all we have is the sway bar to go back in, our exhaust, and then our wheels. So with the sway bar, let's get started on that. We're going to go ahead and feed this up into the control arms through the axles and the lower control arm. Once we get those kind of in the right area, we'll get our two 6mm hex bolts on either end started on the subframe side of things. We're going to keep them loose. That way we can adjust the sway bar up and down to fit it into the arms. We'll torque those ends down, and then we'll come back and torque this down. So, all right, beautiful. At this point, it's not going to fall and hit us on the head. I'm going to start on the passenger side, show you how to get those 13 and 17mm bolt and nut combo back together. We'll replicate the same thing on the driver's side, and then we'll get ready to install our exhaust. All right, once you have both nuts situated, you can go ahead and snug them down. You're going to want to torque them down to 34 Newton meters. Now we have both ends of the sway bar end link brackets torqued to our control arms. Let's go ahead and torque down our brackets behind the subframe. First, I'm going to grab my 6mm hex and just snug them down against the bracket. Now that they are in the right position and our end link brackets are situated, and then we'll grab the torque wrench and torque them down to 16 foot-pounds. And once you've done that to both sides, now you can go ahead and raise up your exhaust, or in our case, we're going to go ahead and reinstall it. So let's do that. That situated, get this one plate situated with our hangers. The other one is just another supporting bracket. All right, right, now we're gonna install our V strut brace. Once you get those 3 16mm bolts in, you're gonna wanna torque them down to 59 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees. Now we're gonna go ahead and slap our wheel back on. And there you have it, my good people. Another DIY in the books. A pretty decent sized job on this car. Arguably almost easier on the ground, as you can just lay on your flat back and wrench your little hands away. Regardless, thank you for watching this video. If you like it, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave them in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.